here at the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. And on behalf of Christian Osterman, the director of the program, I'd like to welcome all of you to the Woodrow Wilson Center for an exciting event featuring the recent release of the transcripts of Lyndon Johnson's office tapes covering February to May 31st, 1964. The meeting is organized by the Cold War International History Project, which is part of the History and Public Policy program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with the center, let me say a couple of words about it and its mission. The Wilson Center is the nation's official living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. President Wilson was an accomplished scholar as well as a national leader, felt strongly that the scholar and policymaker were engaged in a common enterprise. The Center is a nonpartisan institute, a neutral forum for discussion and debate. It takes a historical and broad perspective on the issues. Within the Center, the History and Public Policy program offers a critical and scholarly assessment of newly released historical materials and their impact on public policy. By using historical sources from all sides of the Cold War, from the classified documents to oral history, the program seeks to facilitate a better understanding of U.S. policies and the reaction of other state actors, and in the process improve the ability of policymakers to make informed decisions. It is within the spirit that we organize today's discussion on newly released transcripts of Lyndon Johnson's presidential telephone conversations. Together with the documents and oral histories, those presidential conversations provide an invaluable resource for understanding the process of presidential decision-making in the first months of the Lyndon Johnson presidency. Those recordings, masterfully transcribed and annotated by historians at the University of Virginia Miller Center for Public Affairs, then the Presidential Recording Project, capture a very personal image of the Johnson administration, and Lyndon Johnson specifically. They are a window into the Oval Office. The transcripts capture the natural strength of Johnson's personality and his effectiveness as a political leader. The tapes, as you will see shortly, cover a full breadth of topics facing the Johnson administration, from Vietnam to Europe, and critical domestic policies such as the economy and civil rights. To discuss these findings, we have here today three of the historians intimately involved in the transcription, annotation, and publication of those volumes. First, we have Dr. Ken Germany, who is Assistant Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of South Carolina, and most recently the author of New Orleans After the Promises, Poverty, Citizenship, and the Search for the Great Society, published by University of Georgia Press in 2007. We also have Dr. David Shreve, Assistant Professor of History at the Miller Center for Public Affairs, the University of Virginia. He is currently campaigning to be congressional representative for Virginia's 5th District. Good luck with that.
So everybody gets equal time.
Yes, absolutely. Lastly, we have Dr. Gwen McKee, Assistant Professor of History at the Miller Center for Public Affairs, University of Virginia, and most recently the author of Liberalism and the Problem of Jobs, Public Policy, and Community Action in Post-War Philadelphia, forthcoming at the University of Chicago Press. Gentlemen, the floor is yours. Thank you for coming here today.
Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you to the Wilson Center for inviting us here to talk about LBJ. And we're going to mostly let LBJ do the talking because, trust me, he's far more interesting than we are sitting up here, even though he's dead. And that's one of the great things from the tapes is that these voices continue to live on, and we get to figure out who they were, and everyone brings their new interpretations to the table. I want to say a couple of things about the broader project that produced these volumes. There are three previous volumes, volumes 1 through 3, if I'm doing the math right, which cover from the Kennedy assassination to the end of January, and those were published in 2005. These three volumes are the next installment, which go through the end of May in 1964. There are two more print volumes to come out. The title of those is Mississippi Burning and the Civil Rights Act, and that will carry things through the passage of the Civil Rights Act and end on July the 4th of 1964. After that, the project's publications will be done digitally through the University of Virginia Press's Rotunda imprint, which is one of the leading digital presses in the country, and we're very excited about using these materials in a lot of different ways, and putting them on the web allows us to do that. And I definitely want to thank the National Historical Publications and Research Council, the NHPRC, which funded a substantial portion of this project. And the other funder of this project would be the Miller Center of Public Affairs. And I think all of us here are in have great gratitude for the Miller Center and for UVA for funding history. And that's one of the great things about Thomas Jefferson's University. I'm going to start off here today talking a little bit about what's happening in the world at the end of January 1964 and moving into February, and then I'll hand it off to my colleagues. What's going on in the cold winter of 1964 in terms of foreign policy is that Lyndon Johnson is dealing with lots of different things. One of the most pressing matters is in Panama. There had been a revolt in Panama that the United States had essentially suppressed in early January of 1964. It was the major headline grabber for the early part of January. It was one of Lyndon Johnson's first serious foreign policy crises after taking the Oval Office. In late January, Lyndon Johnson is trying to balance two partners in NATO. There is a brewing civil war in Cyprus between Greeks and Turks who live on the island. And Johnson is trying to massage this to keep two allies from going at each other in the Mediterranean. The big thing that happens at the end of January is a coup in Vietnam. General Win Con leads what was termed a bloodless coup, but it was somewhat of a shock to the United States because the government that had taken hold of power in Vietnam after the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem had fallen. And so this was something of a surprise. And so Lyndon Johnson will spend a great deal of time in these volumes here trying to figure out what's going on in Vietnam. In terms of domestic policy, the Civil Rights Act is before Congress. It's going to be passed by the House during the course of these volumes in February of 1964. And the other major piece of legislation that Johnson is going to push forward is the tax cut bill, $11 billion of tax cuts. And this will be signed toward the end of February in 1964. So the Great Society is on the way. And so these volumes are termed Toward the Great Society. And Lyndon Johnson is taking up the mantle of the Kennedy administration and certainly using the assassination to push forward some of the ideas that had been brewing and coming up with plenty of his own. The first clip that I want to play here today actually comes from Volume 3. And this is on January 28th. And it deals with what Lyndon Johnson deals with, I think, probably in every waking moment of his day, and that's the re-election that's coming up in the fall of 1964. He's very pleased with the speech that Senator Hubert Humphrey had given that morning, and so he called him up to congratulate him. And since we are in the election season and having moved to South Carolina, I've been in that really rich environment where you actually get to see presidential candidates up front, and you can talk to them, and it's one of the great things about American democracy. However, by the end of next Sunday, South Carolina's population is going to drop probably about 2,000 or 3,000 when all the reporters leave and phones stop ringing, and actually phones at my house from people asking who I'm going to vote for. So it's an exciting place to be, and so in honor of our current presidential election, I want to play how Lyndon Johnson characterized what made the Democratic Party, and what people should be talking about.
Well, I'll just say, the reason the Republicans haven't won any elections except Eisenhower, and Eisenhower didn't mess around to this trash. He was a national hero. But the reason they haven't won since Hoover is because they spent all the time on Roosevelt's boy, Jimmy, and on his dog. Yeah. And they spent all the time on Truman and Margaret and the music critics. And they spent all the time on Kennedy and his religion and other things, and they just haven't won one. And if they don't stand for something, hell, if they just come out here and talk about revival of the corn tassel, or come out for Tom Watson watermelons, it'd be something. But they just, by God, against things, against everything, and trying to smear and fear, and that you have no alternative. And the St. Louis Post-Dispatch man asked me today, said, "What Republican frightens you the most?" I said, "Well, not any of them now. When one of them comes out and said, 'This is what I stand for,' and gives me a foreign policy and said, 'Here's what I'm for,' and then he gives me a domestic policy and said, 'Here's what I'm for. Here's what I'm for in the field of education, in the field of manpower, in the field of training, in the field of civil rights,' then I'll get scared, because even if it's different from mine, they'll have a choice. But now they haven't any choice, because we're the only ones that stand for anything. They're just against things." Yes. Just say, "Now, damn it, boys, you get here and get your speech and ask some questions here and get your name in the paper here, and every damn one of them ought to take your line. And what we are, we're for war on poverty. We're for economic growth. We're for world peace. We're for security. We're for Medicare. We're for human dignity. We're for human rights. Now, this is what we stand for: a government of strength, a government that's solvent, and a government that's compassionate."
Yes, sir.
And it just makes these guys look silly.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I just want to congratulate you. I was reading it. It's the best thing I'd seen all day. God damn it, I had Indonesia, and I had Panama, and I had Cyprus, and they're coming in tonight, 7:30. The British trying to shove us in there overnight. And I guess we got to go, but I'm trying my damnedest to get the Turks to agree not to invade so we can hold off another day or two.
I hope so. Well, I just got back here after we'd had that little visit over there. These press boys were all waiting up here to see me, so I just...
Well,
you just let them have it.
You just ought to hit it tomorrow. Just every day you ought to say the Democratic Party is the one party left for America, because the other fellows don't stand for anything.
That's right.
I just, God pity them, for they know not what to do. I just feel sorry for them, because what do they stand for?
So that was Lyndon Johnson taking pity on the Republicans, which he certainly didn't do in the fall, although you can judge for yourself what happens in the next 40 years of American history in terms of what the Democratic Party does and what the Republican Party does. The next clip that I want to play from this is emblematic of a theme that's going to appear throughout these volumes, and that is Lyndon Johnson struggling with foreign policy. And Lyndon Johnson is criticized heavily in the press for not taking a sophisticated approach to foreign policy. And these Eastern liberal press types that Lyndon Johnson loathed, except when he needed them, were writing things in the Washington Post and the New York Times that were heavily critical of Johnson. And so he gets a little bit upset. He's going to take up this Vietnam issue not as the central issue. Vietnam is essentially on the back burner. And in terms of the time that Johnson spends in February and March and April and May, Vietnam is one of several major issues. But he starts talking about things in terms of Vietnam here that I think are going to have real ramifications after the Gulf of Tonkin incident and then in the escalation in early 1965. This particular clip comes after a series of conversations on February 1st. And of all of the days in the Johnson administration where you can see Lyndon Johnson operating, February 1st is a great day because he's going to talk to Sergeant Shriver almost all day. He's going to have 4 conversations with Sergeant Shriver, who is reluctant to leave his post at the Peace Corps to take up the war on poverty. And he's reluctant to do this. He's actually been on a foreign policy trip throughout the world, sort of being an extension of the Johnson administration for Lyndon Johnson. Well, Johnson's going to call up Sergeant Shriver, who is the brother-in-law of the Kennedy family. I think everyone here probably is familiar with him. And simply tell him that they're about to announce him as the director of the war on poverty. And this is going to be quite shocking to Sergeant Shriver. And Shriver will try to hold off the man from Johnson City. And he's not going to be able to do this. And he's eventually going to concede. Johnson goes out to a press conference, announces Sergeant Shriver as the new director of the War on Poverty Initiative, and they fight over that term director. And it's a whole day's long worth of conversation. We don't have enough time to play all of that. But at the end of the day, after they had sort of made amends and they had talked it out, Lyndon Johnson puts out a peace feeler to Sergeant Shriver, sort of testing him out for being the vice presidential candidate in the fall of 1964. And the section here is Johnson talking about the recent coup in Vietnam, talking about the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem, and talking about a couple of other foreign policy things. So here is Lyndon Johnson putting these feelers. One of the things I want to quickly mention about what's going on in here, Sergeant Shriver had been asked by a reporter whether he was, quote, running for the vice presidency. And he said, no, I'm not running for anything, but Robert Kennedy would be, quote, the perfect candidate. And so there's a little subtle piece in here where Lyndon Johnson brings that up, kind of jabbing Sergeant Shriver about there's no need to mention Robert Kennedy as a vice presidential candidate, although he doesn't mention Robert Kennedy by name.
Don't think he's a man in government as valuable as McNamara.
He's terrific, isn't
He just gives you the answers, and he gives you cooperation. He's a can-do fella. He's got imagination and drive, and he's working right now. I don't know where he is, but he's on the job.
Yeah. How is that Vietnam? That the Gaul thing? Isn't that that's really the pain in it?
Well, no, that's all right if we could neutralize all of it. But hell, they don't want to neutralize anything but South Vietnam.
Yeah.
The goddamn Soviet not going to let you neutralize North Vietnam, so you're just whistling through your hat. And the only way to neutralize it is to whoop hell out of it.
Is it going really any better? It looks terrible in the paper.
No, it's we think it's going to go a little better. The last 2 weeks been better.
The ties out there.
We've assassinated a few people, you know, and that always gives us problems. That's not. We went in there and killed them off, and now you see what shape we're in.
I've often wondered how smart that was.
That wasn't smart at all. Wasn't smart at all.
That's the CIA business.
Well, it just wasn't smart at all, my friend.
But we're better off. They were better off than what you got.
I attended one meeting and they asked me my opinion. I said, if you boys want to play cops and robbers, why don't you get on television? But God damn it, let's don't go to doing it with allies, because you take you 6 months to get back where you are now.
Right.
But they want to play cops and robbers, and they have. So anyway, that's water over the dam. You're forward looking in light, and you're going to look to the future. And you just start figuring out, get these men on in here and let them listen to the Heller and the Gordons and the doctors at Harvard. What was his name? I was telling you about a while ago. Galbraith. And then you modernize it and moderate it and get it down to where you can stand on your own hind feet and where it'll stand up for itself. And get ready to be your witness, and let's start rolling it through, and then I'll lend you more years a little bit.
A little bit?
Yeah, a little bit. Now, damn right. No.
Formation state, see?
Well, he's been working for you about 100% of the time, I'll tell you that. He hadn't got any delegates in the field for you. He's got more judgment than that. And he hadn't got your name on any tickets because he's got more brains than that. But he's in there swinging every hour, I'll tell you that.
Did you see what I said about the...
Yeah, I saw you eliminate yourself from the race completely. We'll get you back in it, though.
Well, that's all right, isn't it?
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, that's all right. That's all right. You just don't go to nominating any candidates. I think a man who runs for vice president is a very foolish man.
Yeah.
A man who runs away from it's very wise. I wished I'd run farther away from it, and I did.
Oh, yeah,
but I never was a candidate for it, I'll tell you that.
That
and don't you ever be a candidate. Don't let anybody else be a candidate. And tell them anybody that runs for it never gets it.
That was a great decision, though, that day. The two of you decided to do that.
Well, you just come on now. We've decided this, and I'm with you till the end, and death do us part.
Well, there's not going to be any. There's only going to be
we're not going to let anybody divide us, so just bear that in mind. And when everybody else has quit you and gone and through with you, I'll still be standing there by your side. So let's get going now.
Yes. Okay, thanks very much.
Goodbye.
Well, that's Lyndon Johnson courting a candidate, as only Lyndon Johnson did. And Johnson valued loyalty, and Sergeant Shriver, certainly out of the individuals associated with the Kennedy faction in the White House and beyond, was probably one of the more loyal people to Johnson. And they had a fairly good working relationship for much of Shriver's time. one quick little thing to clear up here is that wasn't John Kenneth Galbraith turning over in his grave because Lyndon Johnson forgot his name. Although I think I would be interested to see what his reaction would be on that score. The next little clip here I wanted to play is on February the 25th, and this is dealing with Vietnam. This is talking with Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense. Lyndon Johnson had, on 4 days before this, given a speech at UCLA, which was a campaign trip to appeal to Latino voters, essentially. He had given a speech, and in this speech had said that the communists were playing a, quote, dangerous game in South Vietnam. And what happens here in this conversation is you see some of the ambivalence of Lyndon Johnson. He is going to talk about 1,000 troops that the Kennedy administration had committed to withdrawing from Vietnam and had withdrawn in December of 1963. Johnson thought that was a bad idea, and he thought it made the United States look weak in the international community. And he said that you shouldn't be talking about withdrawing in public, even though we might do it. During this time, the Johnson administration is going to commit itself publicly to adding more troops or adding, quote, more advisors to South Vietnam. Not troops, but people to train. And so they're going to talk about the value of training South Vietnamese to fight in the conflict that Johnson, at least at this point, is considering only the South Vietnamese. And it is in here where he has this formulation where they have a choice of either more war or more appeasement.
But find 2 minutes in there for Vietnam.
You know, the problem is what to say about it.
All right, I'll tell you what I would say about it. I would say that we have a commitment to Vietnamese freedom. Now, we could pull out of there, the dominoes would fall, and that part of the world would go to the communists. We could send our Marines in there, and we could get tied down in the Third World War or another Korean action. The other alternative is to advise them and hope that they stand up and fight. Now, we think that by training them and advising them, that by training them in a period of 3 years, we can have them trained. Now, this nation has made no commitment to go in there to fight as yet. We're in there to train them and advise them, and that's what we're doing. Nobody really understands what it is out there, and they don't know, and they get to where they're confused, and they're asking questions, and they're saying, why don't we do more? Well, I think this, you can have more war or you can have more appeasement, but we don't want more of either. And it's their war, and it's their men, and we're willing to train them, and we have found that over a period of time that we kept the communists from spreading. We did it in Greece and Turkey with the Truman Doctrine by sending their men. We did it in Western Europe by NATO. We've done it there by advice. We haven't done it by going out and dropping bombs. We haven't done it by going out and sending men to fight. And we have no such commitment there. But we do have a commitment to help the Vietnamese defend themselves. And we're there for training, and that's what we're doing. They say the war is not going good. Well, there are days when we win, there are days when we lose. But our purpose is to train these people, and our training is going good, and we're trying to train them.
All right, sir, I'll get
I don't know if I've said anything there that I shouldn't say. I wouldn't do it, but that's the way you said it to me, and it appealed to me when I say, why in the hell? I always thought it was foolish for you to make any statements about withdrawing. I thought it was bad psychologically. But you and the president thought otherwise, and I just sat silent. Now, you made them. And when I ask you your explanation, you give me a good explanation. And not a damn bit of use having 1,000 people sitting around guarding something that they don't need to guard.
No question about that, Mr. President. The problem is... Really,
all right, then the next question comes is, how in the hell does McNamara think when he's losing the war that he can pull men out of it? Well, McNamara's not fighting a war. He's training men to fight a war, and when he gets them through high school, they will have graduated in high school and have 12 grades behind them next year. And he hasn't taken on any agreement to keep them the rest of their life. He's made a commitment to train them to fight. And if he trains them to fight and they won't fight, he can't do anything about it. Then he's got to choose whether he wants to fight or let them have it.
This is the problem, exactly. And what I fear is that we're right at that point. Well, anyhow, I'll get...
So that's Johnson and McNamara trying to feel their way through the issue of Vietnam. At this point, I want to pass things off to the next congressman from the 5th District of Virginia, or possibly the next congressman from the 5th District of Virginia. I don't want to violate any campaign rules or anything.
Thank you, Kent. I appreciate it.
And then, David and I are both from Louisiana, so I would be expecting a job to come out of any kind of congressional.
That's right. I'm going to follow up with a few conversations. There are 4 of them I have listed here. I'm going to play 3 of the 4. One of them I discovered belatedly has a sound quality problem that might make it difficult to present here, but I'll tell you a little bit about that. One of the things that these recordings offer historians and journalists and scholars in general is unlike selective interpretation based on memo traffic or even recordings such as these, many of which you've heard before, perhaps on C-SPAN radio. Some of you may have read some of the Beschloss volumes where he selects certain key recordings out of this overall collection. But when you look at it as we try to do in this project, step by step by step, that is, all the recordings in a given day. And early on in Johnson's presidency, he recorded quite a few. There are very few days where you don't have at least 15, 20, 25 telephone recordings. What you get to see is the slow development of ideas and policy and problems and crises. And naturally, given the setting here, most of us are going to focus, at least to some extent, on Vietnam and foreign policy. And the first selection that I have here, in a way, follows up with some of the things that Professor Germany has presented. You heard LBJ, for example, say in one of those recordings, "I don't think there's a man in government as valuable as McNamara." Well, the first one I'm going to play here is a conversation with McNamara on March 21st, 1964. And there's 2 parts to this conversation. McNamara is preparing to speak publicly. It's at a dinner in honor of the late James Forrestal. And he wants to say something about Vietnam. Now, interestingly, in the conversation you just heard, Johnson is telling him what we stand for there. In this one, you'll hear him turn the tables and ask McNamara, what is it that we stand for? What can you give me a one-sentence description? And you see McNamara struggle with it a little bit here. But the important thing that this exhibits, at least in part, particularly if you look at the second half of this conversation, and you're able to put it into the context of other events of the previous weeks, other conversations of that day and previous days, is you see the way in which Johnson gets to that point where he believes McNamara is another way he often put it was that guy with the stay comb in his hair is the brightest man in all of government. And he comes to rely on McNamara implicitly, even though he's still pushing him a little bit to nail down what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. And so this first selection will do that. I'm going to cut it off because it's about 6.5 minutes at about the 4-minute mark. The last half of the conversation, Johnson shifts gears a little bit, and he asks McNamara to help him with an upcoming press conference. And he was always doing this. Give me some news. Give me something to talk about. I just can't go in empty-handed. And McNamara struggles a little bit with what to say, and then he falls back on an initiative that he was enmeshed in that had nothing to do directly with Vietnam, but with Pentagon budgets and budgeting and a cost-saving initiative. Professor Germany mentioned the tax cut that had just passed. One of the ways in which Johnson was able to get that thing out of that piece of legislation out of the Senate Finance Committee was to launch an economy crusade so as to convince Senate Finance Chairman Harry Byrd to release the bill to the floor. And this was a crusade that was half phony. That is, they were doing cosmetic touches to the budget to make it look like they were cutting things. But another half of this crusade was real. And that half focused almost exclusively on the Pentagon and the Pentagon budget. And so McNamara really comes through for Johnson in this, and this is what he falls back on. He tells Johnson to, crow about that a little bit, how we are really cutting the budget there and rationalizing the Pentagon budget. And they really were indeed doing just that sort of a thing. So let's...
Can I ask a very brief question?
Yes.
I saw the name Hilsman, Roger Hilsman there, that he had resigned at that time.
That's correct.
Did he resign over a policy matter that he thought we were going the wrong way in Vietnam?
Well, the official reason was no, that he wanted to return to an academic post. The unofficial reason appears to be that, yes, indeed, there was a difference of opinion on Vietnam in particular, on the Far East, and he resigned.
What was his position?
I'm sorry. Can we just hold the questions until we're done? Thank you.
Yeah, we'll be happy to flesh that out a little bit later, but that's a good question. So let's go ahead and roll this tape, Kean.
Hello?
Bob?
Bob McNamara, Mr. President.
How you getting along?
Very well, sir. I called to say that you may remember Dean Rusk, and you and I talked briefly about the need for a Vietnam speech. We prepared such a speech, and Dean and I had discussed the desirability of my giving it next Thursday night. I have to make a speech here in Washington at that time. I sent a draft over to your office last night to Mike Forrestal, who was going to give it to you.
He hadn't given it to me. I'll get it from him and read it over the weekend. I think it's good. I think if you could, that you ought to go up and sit down with Greening and Morris.
Well, I think I should, and I think...
What I'd do is ask Mansfield, just say, now, I don't want to debate. I don't want to argue. I don't want to convince anybody. But I would like for them to know my viewpoint. And I'm going to make this speech, and the President asked me to ask you if you'd get Morris and Greening in your office and let me visit with them a little bit about it.
Very good. I'll do that. I've got to make the speech Thursday night, and I'll do that before I do it Thursday.
I'll get it over the weekend. You going to be at home weekend?
Yes, sir, I will. I think I can take a lot of the heat off of you on this Vietnam issue, Mr. President. There's just a lot of misunderstanding on it in this country, and that's the real purpose for it.
Now, what are we going to do? We're going to do more of the same, except we're going to firm it up and strengthen it, and what else?
Well, it's really a...
What is a one-sentence statement of what our policy is out there?
Our policy is to help Khan provide the physical security and the economic and social progress for his people that he needs in order to gain their support.
All right, but that's what we've been doing.
Well, we haven't done it very effectively, and neither have they.
Why aren't the Russians as interested in this as we are? Why aren't the French and the English? Why do they want the communists to take over all Southeast Asia?
Well, I think the French are obviously pursuing their own national aims, and they think that we're going to lose out there anyhow, and they might as well advance their national strength and prestige while we're losing.
Looks like to me that the Russians would be more interested in saving Vietnam than we are.
Well, you can't be sure what their position is. I think we...
Doesn't that seem logical to you? If they're in a war with them and they got a civil war going on between 800 million Chinese and the Russians, why do they want to see the Chinese communists envelop Southeast Asia?
I think the reason that they can't take a strong position against the Chinese communists here is that to do so will lose them the support of communist parties elsewhere in the world. I think the Soviets are...
I thought they just thought we had an umbrella over them like de Gaulle does and thought we'd do it and they didn't need to do it.
I don't think so. I think they are in a very sensitive position for control of communist parties worldwide. And if they appear to be soft in opposing us in Vietnam, they'll be charged with that and lose control. In any event, I've tried to prepare a strong statement here of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what the prospects are.
All right. What can I say to the press? They're going to come in after a while and just visit with me. Haven't you got something to start?
The pause there is somewhat revealing, but the part that that follows the the section where I stopped is the part where they're talking about the Pentagon budget cutting initiative and so forth. The next one I'd like to play is, I'm going to skip one here. March 28th, Managing Congress and the Press is an interesting conversation, and it's one of the conversations that you come across from time to time where it's more than one person speaking with Johnson, where he's got an advisor cutting in here and there, and oftentimes one or two or three people on the other end of the line. And this one includes Mac Bundy and Bill Moyers and a few other folks. They're discussing, by and large, two things here. The first part of the conversation, which isn't even in this clip, is a discussion of the recent earthquake in Alaska. 8.2 Richter earthquake just hit near Seward, Alaska. As I understand it, this was the second strongest quake ever to hit this hemisphere on record. One in Chile, I think, a little bit later was a bit stronger. So it was a massive earthquake, lots of destruction, and they're obviously concerned about what to do here. And Johnson's in Texas while this is taking place, by the way, at the LBJ Ranch. After that, they pick up the general discussion of foreign policy. And what I found interesting about this conversation, why I wanted to play it, where the sound quality a little bit better, is that it gives you an idea how Johnson has his finger in several dikes, how he's managing different foreign policy crises all at the same time. They talk about Brazil, the recent or the approaching coup in Brazil, which actually takes place within a couple of days of this conversation. A crisis in Zanzibar, Rusk and his approach to a recent speech made by Foreign Relations Chair William Fulbright, which is a speech that was celebrated much later as a much more critical speech than they thought at the time. This was his Old Myths and New Realities speech, which was made this particular week. Walter Lippmann's appraisal of Vietnam policy, they talk about this as well. Lippmann had just gone on a television news broadcast a couple days before this. And then Bundy weighing in on all of the above. So it gives you an interesting glimpse of that. But the next one, and we're going to skip this one, I'm sorry, Gian, but the next one, just a few days later, the coup in Brazil has taken place. Johnson starts off this, as you'll see, by talking about General O'Meara. This is General Andrew Pick O'Meara, who was commander of the Southern Command based in Panama, who was tasked with dealing with the aftermath of the Brazil coup at this time. A quick comment about that. But then the real gist of this conversation is Johnson and McNamara talking about this new guy that McNamara wants to bring in to take over Vietnam policy and perhaps also serve as ambassador once Henry Cabot Lodge steps down, William Westmoreland. And I think you'll find this one to be interesting because what you see is the way in which Johnson expresses skepticism toward this particular candidate early on. Westy is a gentleman. I think we see Johnson gaining confidence in a little as he goes on, but at this point he's not so sure. We'll learn later, of course, that he discovers that Westmoreland was a protege of Matt Ridgway, whom Johnson admired greatly, mostly because back in the 50s it was Ridgway who helped Johnson and Senator Dick Russell stave off American intervention in Vietnam when Eisenhower wanted to go in and help rescue the French. So interesting dynamic at work here. And then there's a little note at the end about Nixon weighing in on Vietnam policy and how Johnson responds to that. So let's go ahead and roll this.
Now, number two, I sure was impressed with this fellow O'Meara.
Yes, I'm glad you were. He's doing a fine job. We've really gone all out to set him up down there. We got him his 4th star, and he's excellent for that command.
Now, we ought to be giving a good deal of thought too, Bob. If Lodge comes out of there, what we're going to do.
I thought you might like to talk about that at lunch. I have given some thought to it. Dean will be present.
You got any prospects?
Yes.
Who?
Yes. I think the man on the job out there is the best prospect, Westmoreland.
To be ambassador?
Yes.
What would you do with Harkin?
Retire.
Well, then who would be the military assistance man?
Well, we have a man under Westmoreland whom we think would be very capable to take command of the military operations. Mm-hmm. We've been looking to this possibility for 90 days now, and I've made a series of moves that put us in a position to carry it out if it seems desirable to do so.
What would you think of someone of the Clay stripe 10 years younger if you could find him?
Well, that's just what we got, Westmoreland.
Is he that good?
He's the best in the Army for it, without question. Now, he may not be good enough, but he's the best we have, without any doubt. And he was sent there specifically for that purpose.
You mean anticipating he might be ambassador someday?
Yes.
What would he do, retire?
No, he'd remain on active duty, but he would fill the joint role of...
Well, can you do that?
Yes. Dean and I have talked about it.
Do you have some military men that are serving as ambassadors still in uniform?
No, but in this particular case, he would take on the ambassador's role as an extra duty. Dean and I have discussed it, and
well, wouldn't he have to go to the Senate and be confirmed?
I can't answer the question. I'll try to get an answer before noontime on it.
Westmoreland was a guy up that is superintendent of the academy.
That's right.
Is he that strong a guy?
Well, he's the best we have, without question. I think he is that strong.
What do you think about Nixon's criticism of Vietnam this morning?
Well, it didn't look to me to be much of a criticism. I read the New York Times report of it. It seemed to me he was agreeing with our program.
Herald Tribune got a headline. He criticizes Johnson's policies.
Well, the Times said that quite the opposite. It said that he fully supported what we'd said. He said, of course, we said it too late, and we've been vacillating in the past, but if we did what we said we're going to do, he thought it was fine. Now, I hadn't actually seen what he said. The Times article is pretty good on it. It's buried in the back of the paper.
All right, what do you think about Panama now?
Enough about Vietnam, as he says. Nixon's criticism, in case you were wondering, could be interpreted two ways, and that's exactly what happened here. The Herald Tribune, known as the Republican newspaper in New York, suggested that it was direct criticism of the Johnson administration and its policy. And they quoted Nixon as saying that we need to take this thing to North Vietnam, perhaps invading North Vietnam and almost assuredly bombing North Vietnam, if nothing less. The New York Times reported it a little bit differently, where it appeared that Nixon was just urging on a more vigorous approach to prosecuting our role as it stood at the time. Nonetheless, I saw that conversation as being significant for what it said about Johnson's tentative embrace of William Westmoreland. The last one I wanted to feature is we're going to shift a little bit to domestic policy, lest we think that Johnson is only focusing on foreign policy crises at this time. This is an example of something that preoccupied him for much of this period, throughout March in particular, and then on into the first weeks of April before he signed the bill about 10 days into the month. And this was the 1964 Farm Bill. Interesting piece of legislation in that Johnson appears to work for it very hard, and he's pulling out all the stops to get his party behind it, and it involves things like getting Adam Clayton Powell to round up his friends in Congress who really have little interest in agricultural policy, Dick Daley in Chicago rounding up the Illinois delegation, where there is a farm bloc, but nonetheless Daley, it's not one that Daley represents, and you see Johnson actually having the most difficulty with his fellow Southerners here as he's rounding up these votes. So this kind of legislative fight is a lot of things wrapped up into one. And what you see in this conversation is Johnson's evident frustration with the effort, and he's talking about a bill signing ceremony now, setting it up so that, now that the bill has passed, we need to get folks in here for, stage a little ceremony, and he's not sure how it's going to come off, and he doesn't know who he can bring in to celebrate this thing, nor whether it's even worth celebrating. And as we'll see, in 1965, he does shift gears, and he introduces a whole different kind of farm bill. This is one he inherited. You'll hear him hint in the middle of this conversation that we bled for Orville Freeman, the Secretary of Agriculture, hinting that this is Freeman's bill, not mine. But again, he saw this as a way in which he could weld a broader Democratic coalition looking ahead to fights on civil rights, looking ahead to the Great Society, things like that. And he saw this as an opportunity to get Southerners back into the fold, so to speak. And the legislation was really two parts. It was about a cotton subsidy that went to textile mills that helped offset an advantage that foreign producers had because we were subsidizing exports of cotton. And then the second part of it was a wheat subsidy that was voluntary. If you agreed to restrict your wheat production, they were going to make up the difference between the expected fall in the price of wheat that year and what they wanted as a target price. So this is what he's talking about here. This is Johnson and Larry O'Brien, one of the holdovers from the Kennedy administration, who worked particularly well with Johnson and whom Johnson came to respect a great deal.
Mr. President, would you consider calling Dick Daly to give him a little thank you on this?
I sure will, and I doubt the wisdom of having all these damn textile rake-offs in here for this signing.
I didn't know about that.
Well, Jim Eastland proposed we have Cannon Mills textiles, and I told him to let you and Secretary of Agriculture decide it.
All right.
And if I were you, I'd just tell them that it looked like a rake-off for textiles, and I'd get every goddamn one Gallus farmer I could. I'd get old E.W. Brooks from Georgia, make North Carolina senators, Mississippi senators, and South Carolina senators, and make them bring a whole bunch of horny-handed sons of toil in here for the picture Saturday. And I'd get to work on it, get Freeman to work on it, tell him if he's got one goddamn dirty tobacco-chewing farmer as far as this bill, get him in here. I don't think he has. I think they're all towel manufacturers.
Yeah, I think...
But just tell him that in that kind of language. Can you Irish talk that kind of language? Or?
I've tried it a couple of times. I think I can do it.
All right, well, I don't want you to try it on me. on Freeman. So we blessed for him.
Okay.
I don't want to plead for him anymore. I'll call Dick Daly in the morning the first moment I get.
All right. Very good.
All right, now you get that ceremony and let's stack them in.
All right. I will, Mr. President.
You call Freeman right away.
I will.
Now, Adam Clayton Powell, what's that payoff? You got him on 11 o'clock in the morning.
Well, he didn't tell me any of the specifics. He just wants conversation, but I'm going to try and put together all the things that he's interested in.
You just feed me to the wolves and just barehanded, huh?
No, I'll have something for you.
Take my clothes off of them and turn me loose naked into a vulture's hand.
No, all that'll happen on that is that after you talk to him, we can get him back to Puerto Rico over the weekend. You won't see him for a while.
All right, okay. When are you going to get your poverty bill out?
Tonight.
No. When really? April?
Yeah, we should. We're going over now a schedule that we're going to take up with the leadership on things we think they ought to be moving immediately.
The two things I want to move on is pay and poverty.
Yeah, well, I discussed pay with both Albert and Boggs. There's a little conflict, as you know, in their view and the
Get a hold of this ambassador to Jamaica and ask him if he's going to underwrite this pay bill, and if so, get the hell to work on it.
Brief note, Bill Doherty, the ambassador to Jamaica, was the former head of the Postmasters Union, so that's why he was involved in what was a lobbying for a federal pay bill to raise the pay of federal employees. And with that, I'll hand it off to Professor McKee, and he'll add a few other conversations to the mix.
Thank you, David. I want to join my colleagues in thanking the Wilson Center for bringing us here today. It's a wonderful opportunity to be here with you. I also want to just briefly thank a few other people. David Coleman, sitting here in the front, is the current program chair of the recordings program at the Miller Center, and thank you to him for his efforts in arranging this as well. And I should also mention that he's the technical genius behind our flash transcripts, the one who's made it possible for you to see the words as well as hear them. I should also mention Tim Naftali, the former director of the program, current director of the Nixon Library, who was director during most of the time that we were actually preparing this, and fought many fights for him. We owe him a great debt as well. I want to begin also on foreign policy. We've talked quite a bit about Vietnam, or heard conversations about Vietnam, but as Kent mentioned, early in Johnson's presidency, Latin America was really a central focus in foreign policy and really Johnson's first serious test, as much or more so than Southeast Asia. That begins to shift by the end of the period covered in these 3 volumes. But early on and right up to about the start of the volume that I worked on, Volume 6, beginning in mid-April, Latin America is an equal player. First, the crisis in Panama, largely at its core over the future of the Panama Canal, and then the military coup in Brazil. I want to begin there with the question of how the administration would handle publicly the coup, its recognition of the new military government, and the tone that would be taken. A bit of context is important here. The Kennedy administration had tried to implement a new policy towards Latin America under the framework of what was known as the Alliance for Progress. In its essential core goal, the Alliance for Progress sought a formula of democratization, economic reform, as a way to capture the insurgent movements from the left in Latin America and divert them away from the Soviet and more directly Cuban sphere of influence, hoping that reform and serious democratization pushed by and funded by the United States would capture these movements in a way that would serve American interests. This had run into all sorts of problems in terms of actual implementation. The idealism was clear, the mechanism for doing so not so much. Johnson had been broadly supportive of this as vice president. By the time of the assassination, though, he, along with many in the State Department, had become somewhat disillusioned with the approach and sought a much more pragmatic, in some respects harder line policy towards Latin America. This was clear when he appointed Thomas Mann, a career Foreign Service officer, as head of the Alliance for Progress and his special assistant for Latin American affairs. Mann was seen as a hardliner, as favor of economic development in close engagement with business interests in Latin America. This deeply offended elements of the Kennedy faction, even though Kennedy himself had probably been moving in this direction. People like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in particular essentially leaves the administration over this, makes a number of public statements that greatly angered Johnson. The context here, as I said, is that how they're going to respond to the installation of General Humberto Castello Branco as the new president of Brazil, the military leader who had led the coup and had recently been installed as president of Brazil. Now, this is a brief selection in a conversation with McGeorge Bundy. It's primarily interesting for the response, at least in its immediate level, the response that Johnson has, the words, the language that he uses to what was happening in response to what was happening in Brazil, that the new military government was locking up many supporters of the former left-leaning presidents. And Johnson basically says, well, yeah, that's a good idea, and I wish we'd do a little bit of that here. It's really quite shocking, really kind of chilling in many respects. It raises, actually, a central issue to using these tapes, these recordings, as historical sources. They're tremendously valuable if they capture a moment. What does this really tell us about Johnson's thinking about Latin America specifically, human rights more generally? It's an offhand remark, yet there's something telling, the fact that he did say it. And it speaks to the nature of what the tapes really are. They are one historical source, a particularly valuable one, but one that needs to be weighed in relationship to the rest of the record, the written record, the oral history record. The tapes are not, important as they are, they're not a Rosetta Stone, and they have to be used very carefully and very critically. Nonetheless, play the tape, and you can draw your own conclusions. Johnson does say what he says.
Now, anything else?
Yes, sir. We've got a message that we want to send out to Castello Branco on the occasion of his inauguration. They reckon there's a difference between Gordon, who wants to be very warm, and our view in the White House, which is that you ought to be a little careful while this fellow's locking people up, and that a more routine message would be desirable at this stage.
Well, I'd be a little warm. That'd be mine. I'd lean over a little.
You would?
Yeah, I think
it'll be published.
I know it, but I don't give a damn.
Right.
I think that there's some people that need to be locked up here and there too. I haven't got any crusade on them, but I don't want them. I wish they locked up some before they took Cuba. I don't want to be effervescent and overflowing and just go.
You want to encourage him and say we're going to be working
I want to be about
together.
like I was with the King of Jordan this morning. I want to be warm and friendly and express the best wishes and hopes for a democratic, constitutional, progressive operation, and say it takes both. That in this world we live in, that we got to work closely together, and we're ready to work together with the constitutionally selected government there, and we want him to know that we're interested in people everywhere, in particular in his great country.
Okay, I got it. I can fix that.
A quick note there on the reference to the Brazilian Constitution, that despite the coup, there had been a process in which he was officially installed, Branco that is, as president. And so Johnson was able to frame it in those terms in his response. I want to turn next back to domestic issues, and in particular civil rights, which we haven't said a lot about. And this conversation actually is, I guess, touches only incidentally on civil rights, although in one subtle but important way. This is a conversation with, again, Senator Humphrey from Minnesota, who at this point was the Democratic floor leader for the Civil Rights Bill in the Senate. The Civil Rights Bill, of course, at this point is facing the Southern filibuster, and early in a process of negotiation with the Republicans and the leader, Senator Dirksen, about to what extent the House bill, already passed by the House, would be amended to ensure adequate Republican support to break the filibuster and then pass the bill. Couple of points of context in this conversation. A few days before, Humphrey had been quoted as saying that the president would be open to amendments in contradiction to the administration's stated position. Johnson called him later in the day about this, and they had a rather forthright and open conversation about it, shall we say, in the way that only Lyndon Johnson could have forthright conversations. Humphrey later told the press, supposedly, that he had been given unshirted hell by Johnson. Later issued a retraction. There was another conversation with Johnson that day. He was also observed on the floor of the Senate, looking up at the press gallery and making some kind of a motion around his ears. Now, that could have been interpreted as possibly, I can't hear you, but it also could have been interpreted, and was by the press corps, as a reference to another famous event in the early Johnson administration, which had also just taken place. Many of you remember this incident. This is the incident with the Beagles, Johnson's two Beagle dogs, him and her. Johnson, this is a few days before this conversation, late April, I believe, if memory serves. Johnson had just given a triumphant speech to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, reaching out to the business community. It was a very tense occasion, and Johnson had just nailed it. He comes back to the White House, holds a meeting with a group of bankers, and then they go out on the White House lawn for a photo opportunity. Johnson's dogs come out, and for some reason he decides to show them off to the press by picking them up by their ears. The dogs yip, the cameras snap, and you have essentially an international incident with animal lovers. Johnson is obsessed with that through the next few days. Just about every conversation, he brings it up with whoever he's talking to, explain his view on how to treat a beagle, which you will hear here. Humphrey making a motion to his ears in this context was not a wise move, as we'll see. In any case, that's the one element. Another key element here, we've already heard about the vice presidential selection process going on. Humphrey, of course, is a leading candidate at this point and the eventual vice presidential choice as Johnson's running mate later in August. And so the effort here involves all these elements with the rights bill, with this crazy incident with the dogs, and did he not, but also the way that Johnson manages Humphrey in this situation is really telling, and you'll see that in reference to the title of this conversation. Let's see, a few names I should mention. for clarity. One is Gloria Richardson, a name most of you are probably not familiar with. Gloria Richardson was an African-American woman who was a leader of a very active civil rights movement in Cambridge, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore. We think of the civil rights movement as being primarily Southern in this period. Really not, I mean, it absolutely was, but there was also a tremendous amount of ferment beginning in the North, as well, in the Middle Atlantic, in the case of Maryland, but also in the North as well, something that's often lost. There's a reference to Richardson coming out against Johnson, also Roy Wilkins, the director of the NAACP at the time. And we see here Johnson's recognition of his own weakness relative to civil rights leaders and liberals in his own party. Yet another contextual matter that's packed into this relatively short clip.
I got your note here. Nobody's in the room when I talked to you, and I read that story, and I thought it was just my friend talking too much up there. I thought you just, that was your way of expressing it, because I didn't feel like I was giving you unsure tale. I was just trying to clear it out.
I didn't either.
And you just talk when you ought to have been listening. That's a problem that all of us got with dogs and everything else.
Well,
yes. I read the story, and it looked like it came right from you, and you just said, "Oh, God Almighty, I just caught hell."
No, I tell you what, the only
there's nobody here that I've got a diary, and it shows that Senator Kennedy came in 3 minutes after I talked to you, but he wasn't in the room, and no one was in the room with me. And I wasn't giving any unshared hell anyway. I was just clarifying it. I want to be awfully careful. If they'd like to lay, I think you could get by with repealing the goddamn bill. But I think if I change one comma, Gloria Richardson's already gone out here at some of the Justice Department's indication and said she has no confidence in me. And that's what they're doing, and I want to be awfully careful, and that's all I was saying.
I understand that. Look, I'm not being critical of you at all.
I know it, but I don't want to hurt you. I want to help you. I'm trying to build you up. I'm trying to make you the greatest man in the world. And I'd be the last man in the world to say I ever correct you about anything. I might say you corrected me.
Well,
but nobody in this office did it, and it didn't come from here. And you better just check and see who is in your own office, or if you told somebody that you just caught the devil, or you're sweating because Johnson kept you late. Or I saw a story, and one of them said that you held up your ears like a beagle had been a hold of you. And,
I did not.
And said that they had a debate in the press corps whether you were cupping your ears trying to hear them or hold them up like a beagle dog.
Exactly. Of course,
they got it wrong on the beagle dog. All I'm doing is holding the beagle up so he could get the front of his picture instead of his ass.
I know.
They got his ass for 10 days here, and I want to show him a good, well-formed head. And besides, when the hound dog barks, I don't want to get in the paper on this, but that's his pleasure. That's not his hurting.
Well, let me just say, the only person that I mentioned that you and I had talked at all to was Roy Wilkins.
That's enough.
Roy Wilkins. And I did this because I wanted him to know that anything that might have been in the paper in reference to you was only.
Well, he's probably trying to correct it to help both of us, but it hurts you in Minnesota. I don't want to do it. I want to do anything I can to help you. Now, they want McCarthy coming in here to take a bunch of pictures for his book. I told him send him on in. We'll do that, and I'm not worried, but I don't want you to ever think that I'm not. I don't want to help you.
Well, I know you wouldn't. I wasn't. I just thought that I was told by one of the
Senator Kennedy. I talked to you at 12:11, and he came in at 12:14. That's what our diary shows, and they have me tapped. They have everything I do. I can't even hold up a dog without getting in the paper about it. Go on. You going to do making any progress?
Well, we're going to start meeting on Tuesday with Mr. Dirksen and see what he has in mind. We had quite a little session around here today going through all the possibilities, the pitfalls of the arrangements between the House and the Senate in case this bill is amended over here. But we'll do the best we can in these meetings. I've tried to make it crystal clear around here that we've got our job to do, what your position is. We know what it is. We'll just go ahead and do the best we can.
God bless you, my friend.
Yes, sir.
Bye.
Bye.
Notice something else very subtle there at the end, that all this started, of course, with reference to amending the Civil Rights Bill. And Humphrey talks about meetings with Dirksen, and we're going to start talking the process and what happens if it doesn't get amended. And we know your position, but there's an implication there that we're going to have to compromise with Dirksen. Johnson knows this all along, and he's already started to move down the road towards the relatively minor amendments that do go through and allow the bill to pass. And the process there within this conversation is indicative too. The term the Johnson treatment is a famous one. It usually refers to Johnson's physical presence and the way he would literally physically intimidate people by getting up in their face, into their personal space. But he does this on the phone too, and you see that happening here with Humphrey. Okay, we've talked a bit about the way different policy issues intertwine, and we see this really very clearly in the next selection. I believe it was David mentioned the push for economy, the budget, the economy crusade that Johnson had undertaken in order to get his tax cut through, get his budget passed, and the way that the really substantive elements of that largely occurred in the Department of Defense. One of those areas was looking at defense infrastructure within the United States, defense installations all around the country. McNamara was sent out on a tour of most DoD installations around the country to personally evaluate them, which was something he loved doing. I mean that quite literally. He loved getting into the nitty-gritty of management of this stuff and evaluation. If you know anything about his kind of technocratic background, you can understand that. And the explicit idea was to find installations that were outdated, that weren't really necessary, that could simply be closed to save money in the Pentagon budget. That, of course, as you're all well aware, is a process that immediately becomes politically fraught. And as soon as you've begun such a set of evaluations, every congressman is concerned about the defense installations in his or her district. And this became an immediately salient issue for Johnson, for his legislative agenda in the area of the war on poverty. This linked into yet another set of issues. And this is the question of the role of Catholicism in American politics and public policy. Now, we tend to think there's this storyline that's been going on, particularly in relation to the current Romney campaign and the Mormonism issue, that John Kennedy in 1960 went to Houston and gave a speech about Catholicism to the Baptists and never was it heard about again in U.S. politics. Not at all true. Catholicism was still a very, very live, very controversial issue 4 years later. It had actually scuttled Kennedy's attempt to pass a federal education bill directly on the question of what kind of aid would be given to parochial schools, and was still a very powerful, very explosive subject in terms of the war on poverty, because of the degree that it was going to involve direct federal aid to local agencies. If you know anything about the war on poverty and its structure, the idea was to get in, build new institutions, reinvigorate old ones. Well, one of the major existing institutions is the Catholic Church and the parochial school network. And of course, there's a huge, in the northeastern, Midwestern cities, Catholic Democratic voting bloc, and key congressmen, particularly in the House, who represented those districts. And what had happened was, just as there had been a push by those congressmen for federal aid to education in 1961, they looked for the same kind of aid through the war on poverty, particularly the Community Action Program. Would it be able to fund especially remedial education programs through the parochial schools? A group of Catholic congressmen led by Hugh Carey of New York, who incidentally was the congressman from Brooklyn, you'll see the significance of that in a minute, led a group of Catholic congressmen who introduced an amendment to allow funding of parochial schools. This threatened to undermine the whole bill, because the Southern Democrats were not going to go along with this. Even relatively moderate people like Carl Albert from Oklahoma, not by any means the Deep South, calls Johnson and says, if this goes through, I'm gonna lose. You can't do this. They're gonna vote me out in the hills of Oklahoma. And this is the light version of this compared to what others within the Democratic coalition are saying about this. Tip O'Neill then intercedes and basically tries to broker a deal where he will vote against the Kerry amendment in exchange for the administration agreeing to back off on McNamara's plan to close the Boston Navy Yard and the Watertown Arsenal, also in Massachusetts. Johnson is incensed with this, as you'll see in this conversation. I'm going to play the conversation here, but what it really tells us is the way these issues intersect, and you see the power of core governmental questions about what gets spent, where, what it does, whom it benefits. The basic issues of political economy as well as politics packed into this conversation, dealing with two of the great figures of American political life, Tip O'Neill and Lyndon Johnson. The conversation is actually with John McCormack, who was Speaker of the House at this point. If you remember anything of McCormack, he was relatively elderly at the point that he became Speaker upon the death of Sam Rayburn of Texas, one of Johnson's great mentors and a tremendously effective, powerful speaker. McCormack, many thought, was really past his prime. His position in the line of ascension at this point with no vice president was a source of real concern. But in any case, you can see McCormack trying to parry with Johnson. Bill Moyer, special assistant to the president, is also on the line, makes a brief comment at the beginning that you'll hear.
Well, now you better call Kerry in and see what the hell's wrong there. Let's don't get this in a religious fight. I'll do more for the religious people than anybody ever has, and 10 times as much as Kennedy did. I can tell you that. But I can't do it till the election. I've got to win an election in November, and I can't win the election if they just sit up there and do nothing and go home and campaign and put off and go to Puerto Rico and this damn poverty bill.
That's a reference to Adam Clayton Powell.
Here for 3 months, and they put off and they wait for somebody to come back, and every man wants to go. And they tell me they only had 4 for the hearing this morning. And it's just disgraceful.
What can you do with that? They won't be there.
I just think you just have to call in Kerry and say, now let's get this by the election and let's get it started. And then Johnson will help us all he can. And I've got as much influence with Johnson as I have anybody in America. And you have too. And
well, you're going to put one of the leading Catholic laymen in the country to run the program. And there's administrative ways.
I've got Sergeant Shriver. I thought I'd take care of the Catholics, putting him in charge of it. And if they can't trust him to run it decent, if they can't trust me to run it decent, we'll go out to these school boards and tell them to go over and help the adult education class if the Catholic Council wants it operated. But let's don't make a big issue of it up here and write it in the law that we got to put private schools, because we just won't have a law. Charlie Halleck's using the Negro and using the religion. And that's the lowest instincts you can appeal to, but they do it.
They do anything. You've heard me mention it.
Well, you just better spend your afternoon on Kerry and O'Neill and Delaney and see what's wrong with them. And I wouldn't mind you bringing the whole Rules Committee down here to have coffee with me. Let's see whether we're a party or whether we're not. If we're not, hell, I'll let them nominate somebody else. I don't care. I don't want to go through this kind of stuff. If I take a program like the poverty program and got all the people like Phil Landrum and people like that for it, and then, by God, my liberals run out and start causing me trouble.
Yeah, I know. I understand. I thoroughly understand.
You get them in, and if you think it's advised, you talk to Carl and Hale, whoever it is, and let's just...
With me now. We're having a meeting now.
Let's give them a leadership, and if they don't want to follow it, well, they can go to hell with it, as far as I'm concerned, because I work my heart out day and night, and the people approve it, and I come back and get in some professional politician and said, well, it doesn't do anything for my district, therefore I'm against it. And I can't write legislation for private schools. He knows that.
Well, he ought to know it.
Kennedy knows it, and
sure.
I'll talk to Spellman, and I'll talk to whoever I need to talk to, but I'll help them, and I've got a Catholic running it. I don't know how strong I can get. I've got 2 Catholic leaders, the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader of the Senate. I've never shown any NYA. They said I was the best in the United States. I went out to St. Edward's University, and every Catholic school they had, the Lady of the Lake and every one of them, and I gave them a damn world with a ring around it, and Sergeant Shriver's not going to be unjust to them, and just quit letting Halleck put up these damn things and fight about them. Kerry ought to have more sense than that. You get those 3, and if you want me to meet with the Rules Committee tomorrow afternoon, or just meet with a few of them, and tell Tip O'Neill his damn Boston Yard would done been closed if it hadn't been for Lyndon Johnson. And Brooklyn, too. Well, I see these interviews in the paper about how he's going to be independent. Well, now, I don't like to be threatened. And it's the worst thing could happen to me, because then it makes me look like if I don't close the yard, I'm afraid of it. He ought to lay low and keep quiet. I made McNamara agree to go to every damn yard himself, and it'll take him a year before I let him touch one of them. And the truth is, they ought to be closed, Mr. Speaker. They just ought to be. We're wasting money there. But the Brooklyn boys got no jobs, and the Boston boys will have no jobs until I can get this unemployment down. I just said, you got to study them. But God Almighty, we're up now $52 billion a year on defense, and we've got to cut out some of these things where we don't need them. If we don't, well, we'll be up to $62 billion. And what's happening in this world of ours, one man can fire a missile. And they used to take a damn division, you know. And you've got to have a big bunch of them in an airplane, but a missile, you have them. And we get this automation's what's screwing us to death. We're just losing all these jobs. We got more people ever before, but what they're doing, they're cutting out the jobs. And I'm keeping them now just as a pure WPA, Brooklyn and Boston both, without any question. I did it, and I told you not to open your mouth about it, and for nobody else, because I knew they'd criticize it. Like I said, I bribed them on the railroad strike. But I said, don't you open your mouth, don't you even protest to me. I'm going to tell them I haven't even talked to John McCormick. Because I don't have to be told when Brooklyn and Boston and Philadelphia, hell, I know how they vote. I read that when I was a little boy. And I'm the man that's running in November, so I ought to have a slight interest myself, oughtn't I? Sure. So Tip doesn't need to jump on me.
Okay, I should have mentioned that McCormick is from Massachusetts, Catholic congressman himself, who had been one of the leaders of the essentially defeating the aid to education bill under Kennedy. But now as Speaker in the House, he had to at least play along with the administration. But he was in this really tough position, not a strong leader, and it's his own core group of congressmen, his main closest allies, that are causing this problem. The reference to automation is important too, and the drive to attack unemployment. A lot of the unemployment during the period was concentrated in some of these industrial neighborhoods where you were starting to see the first hits of what would be essentially deindustrialization, the movement away from the old manufacturing base. Historian Tom Sugrue and others have shown the origins of that in the 50s, and you see the reference automation was one of the favored explanations at the time, and Johnson's clearly aware of this debate. Okay, to close out the formal presentation today, I want to go with a relatively short clip back to Vietnam. This is with Johnson and Georgia Senator Richard Russell, another one of Johnson's closest mentors, as I'm sure many of you are aware. Russell, at this point, is also leading the filibuster against the Civil Rights Act. So the protege and the mentor are now divided on this key issue of domestic public policy, really the key social issue, and bar none, in the country at the time. Yet they're still very close. Russell is still a very trusted advisor on many other issues, and including Vietnam. We heard a couple of the conversations earlier in the winter and the spring about Johnson's questions about Vietnam and Southeast Asia, where he was really still trying to feel out his position. What we see in this conversation, which is actually one of a series around this time with people like Adlai Stevenson and Bundy and Russell a couple of times, is something slightly different. Now Johnson is expressing real doubt, real fear even, about what he's undertaking, and also a sense, a really tragic sense, of being trapped by politics, by ideology, by the global geopolitical situation. And all of the tapes, probably the most poignant I've heard is one with John Kennedy a few weeks before his assassination, reading a storybook about the changing seasons to his children. Other than that, though, these conversations, because what they show of Johnson's internal turmoil and pain over this decision, and his own inability to summon the resolve to do what he or to stop what he sees happening and the tragedy that's about to unfold is tremendously powerful. This is just one relatively short excerpt from a much longer conversation with Russell. It goes on for close to half an hour, and all of it's really tremendous in this sense. This one, though, I love because of the, I guess as a historian, the obscure but really powerful reference that's made. And the reference is to a man named Ben Milam. Ben Milam was a heroic figure in the Texas independence struggle in the 1830s and 40s. And Milam had, against the consensus, the other leaders of the Texas fighters, led a wintertime raid on San Antonio, a successful one against the Mexican forces, but was killed in the process. And he was lionized in Texas history as a result of this. And Johnson makes a reference to him in relation to a discussion of the proposals of French President Charles de Gaulle for neutralization of the Southeast Asia region, and Senator Mike Mansfield's support for that. And the way Russell eventually turns that example around is striking, and you'll hear that quite clearly.
I just don't know. It's a tragic situation. It's just one of those places where you can't win. Anything you do is wrong.
Well, think about it. Call me.
All right, so I thought about it. I have worried about it, and I have afraid about it.
I don't believe we can do anything.
Religiously, I have, because it's something that frightens me, because it's my country involved over there. And if we get into there on any considerable scale, there's no doubt in my mind of what the Chinese will be in there, and there we'd be fighting a dang conventional war against our secondary, not potential threat. And it'd be Korea on a much bigger scale and a worse scale, because the peculiar physical configuration of Korea made extensive guerrilla fighting impossible, but that's not true over in there. If you go from Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam and bring North Vietnam into it too, it's the damnedest mess on earth. The French report they lost 250,000 men and spent a couple billion of their money and $2 billion of ours down there, and just got the hell whipped out of them. And they had the best troops they had, including practically a division of crack German troopers who were starving and enlisted in the Foreign Legion, went down there.
You don't have any doubt, but what if we go in there and get them up against the wall, the Chinese communists are going to come in?
There's no doubt about it.
That's my judgment, and our people don't think so.
There's no doubt in my mind about it. That you'll find Chinese volunteers in there as soon as you get, very shortly after we have active combat units engaged.
Now, Mike writes me a memo, and all he says is that we continue to support the Vietnamese, and that's number one. An end to the reflex of pique and face-saving at every essay of de Gaulle's. Well, we've not piqued. We just asked de Gaulle to give us a blueprint, and he don't have it. He just says neutralization, but ain't nobody wants to agree to neutralization. And we asked him who will agree to go with old Ben Milam. We're ready, but he just says, well, we have to continue to maintain our strength and get in a position. But he's got no blueprint. 3, a realistic facing of the fact that we are in this situation without reliable military allies. Well, I know that. 4, an exploration of the possibility of the United Nations or some other arrangement. Well, this is Mike Mansfield, and they won't do a damn thing, even on the Cambodia border. We can't get a majority vote in the Security Council. A willingness to entertain any reasonable proposals for international conferences. Well, we are ready to confer with anybody anytime, but the conferences ain't going to do a damn bit of good. They ain't going to take back and give us territory and behave. We tell them every week. We tell Khrushchev. We send China and Hanoi and all of them word that we'll get out of there and stay out of there if they'll just quit raiding their neighbors. And they just say, screw you.
That's right.
So the conferences won't do it. Now, the whole question, as I see it, is it more dangerous for us to let things go as they're going now, deteriorating every day?
I don't think we can let it go, Mr. President, indefinitely.
Then it would be for us to move in.
We either got to move in or move out.
That's about what it is.
Future. You can make a tremendous case for moving out.
Now you take the Nixon.
Good one for moving in, but
Nixon, Rockefeller.
It would be more consistent with the attitude of American people and their general reactions to go in, if they could understand that. But getting out, even after we go in and get bogged down in there with the war with China, it's going to be a hell of a mess. It'd be worse than we are now. to some extent, that's what makes it so difficult. And don't forget that old Ben Milam was the only man got killed. He said, who'd go with old Ben? He's a great hero, but he got killed.
That's right.
And the old man was killed. And they start off with Ben Milam, which they ain't going to do to any inside degree. They'll get out and Ben will be killed. It's just a hell of a come-on. I don't know how much Russia, they won't cause us all the trouble they can, but if there's any truth in the theory that they are really at odds with China, and really is a cleavage there.
They are, but they'd go with them as soon as the fight started. They wouldn't forsake that China, that communist philosophy.
I wasn't talking about the fight in there, but what we might get them to take an active part in getting those in getting the thing straightened out. However,
we're doing all we can on that, but she doesn't show any signs of contributing anything.
They'd be foolish to, from one extent, because we just continue to pour the money in there and get nothing back out of it. We don't even get goodwill back out of that. And I just don't know. And I don't know where to go for advice. I just don't know where to go for it. McNamara is the smartest fellow any of us know. But he's got so damn, he is opinionated as hell, and he's made up his mind on this, and I don't think any amount of claim.
Well, now I'll tell you what he's done, Dick. I think he's a pretty flexible fella. He's gone out there, and he's got Khan to agree that we cannot launch a counteroffensive or hit in the north until he gets more stabilized and better set in the south. And he thought he's buying us time and we could get by till November. But these politicians got to raising hell, and Scripps Howard writing these stories, and all the senators, Nixon and Rockefeller and Goldwater all saying, let's move, let's go in the north.
So we see the press of the presidential campaign coming in there at the end and the immediate political pressure. Russell's commentary on McNamara at the end is fascinating as well. And that kind of critical view of McNamara comes up with a number of congressional leaders. McCormick, in another conversation, basically tells Johnson he just can't stand the guy, that he's arrogant and rude and doesn't respect congressional leadership. But the other substantive thing, of course, in this conversation that's really central is the issue of the Sino-Soviet split and how you weigh that into the calculations that the policymakers are facing, the differences within the administration on that issue and how it affects the deliberations on Vietnam is central as well. It's another thing that we see in this period as being a issue that was repeated in these conversations. With that, I'm going to open to the floor for any questions.
All right. I just want to remind all of you that since we're taping this, if you could please wait for the microphone and make sure you identify yourself. That would be very helpful to all of us.
Before we have a question, I do want to say there's one editor that's not here with us, Robert David Johnson, who's an outstanding historian of Congress in the Cold War, and I believe he's in Israel.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm Morris Wolf. I'm here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I lived through this period as an aide to Senator Cooper during the Civil Rights Act, and while he was on the Warren Commission, the Assassination Commission, I used to drive him every day over to those meetings. And I just want to comment, having lived it, it's interesting to look and listen to historians examine it. The question I'd like to ask is this. It seems that people like Johnson and Russell were so capable on domestic matters. War on poverty was a decent idea. They worked on it. Johnson was a brilliant operative, no doubt about it. Great arm twister, got people to do things, got Richard Russell to go on the Warren Commission, which he said he'd never do. And I wonder why they were so good at domestic and so off on the international. I mean, the Vietnam involvement, the missing the whole way that Cambodia, the rest of it. And could it be that in the training of these human beings, they are trained on domestic matters and somehow never got any acculturation or training or education about what the international life's really about, so that they became mesmerized by people like McNamara, who I feel was also way off. And How do we understand this dichotomy is my question, of such skill in domestic and such lack of skill, in my opinion, in the international? That's
a great question. It's certainly true that Johnson's key interest, his real passion, was domestic policy. I don't know if I'd agree that he didn't have training, particularly in the international arena and acculturation. He had made a number of extensive tours during his time in the Senate. David may be able to speak to this even more in the details, and as vice president, that I think really did give him in-depth, hands-on experience, even in World War II, to a lesser and more political degree. I think that's certainly there. I would point as much to acculturation of a different kind, and the Cold War assumptions, and particularly the experience of the loss of China, and the effect that had on Harry Truman's presidency. That's something that Johnson makes reference to quite commonly in the conversations, that fear of the political consequences of losing another country to the communist advance. That would be where I would put the motivation. There's certainly an appeal that McNamara had, and Johnson shared respected McNamara's technocratic skill. He was very much a liberal of his period in that sense, and believing in technical solutions, and to that degree trusted people like that probably more than he should have. But others can fill that out or differ.
There also in a related matter, there also appeared to be a kind of appreciation within the administration in general, shared by Lyndon Johnson, that technocrats like McNamara were on to something here. And one thing that comes readily to mind is the way in which there was a connection here, not often talked about, between what they later, the policy they later adopted with the bombing and bombing pauses and game theory, cutting-edge game theory of the era. And it was being suggested that these theories suggest that if you take this approach, Mr. President, and if we do this sort of thing, it will bring the North Vietnamese to the bargaining table, to the negotiations, and that's what we want. And in retrospect, it looks like everybody was wrong. So you can be expert and experienced and have an instinct, and I think the other thing to always remember about Johnson is that whether he was considering a withdrawal or felt that he was sliding into a trap, he still appeared to believe throughout in the value of what he often called the limited war, that is, just protecting the South Vietnamese against communist predation. And there's hints of that in some of these conversations. So no matter how much doubt and skepticism filled his own mind, he still feels like that is a worthwhile thing to do. And the evidence he was getting from the field was, I think, just enough to confirm him in that regard. That is, there was evidence that some of this was happening, that American soldiers were protecting South Vietnamese people and villagers against communist predation. The tragedy may be here on that count that we didn't have enough good intelligence about where it was failing early on and where it wasn't working, and how it appeared to be, the successes appeared to be the exception rather than the rule.
My quick answer to that is Lyndon Johnson throughout his career was an enabler. He got things done. He built bridges. He built dams. He made people wealthy. He punished people who needed to be punished. He stood in the way of power, whether his or in a larger sense. And domestically, I think it's much easier to count the votes. It's much easier to figure out what the constituencies are, and it's much easier to get a lay of the land. And I think he relied on this very intricate system of information gathering that he had been developing for several decades in Washington, D.C. And so, in the domestic sphere, Lyndon Johnson was literally the master. And I think when he steps into looking at international policies, there's this argument that he was from the country, and Dick Russell maybe was from the country, and they were Southerners, and they were sort of blinded by their kind of paternalism and with their sort of narrow view of American nationalism. And there may be something to that, but part of it is that the international stage is not Congress, and it's not Washington, D.C., and it's not the hill country of Texas, where you can figure out who's on what side. And so I think part of it is in the nature of the training.
Could I
Just one very brief point.
Just can you?
When we would go over to the Senate and listen to Wayne Morse alone rail against McNamara's war, there was a voice of reason there that no one was listening to except Senator Cooper and a handful who, out of respect, would go and sit and listen to Wayne Morse's very honest, accurate, intelligent attitude. And I think there was this headstrong feeling of, well, nail their asses to the wall, his comment about the coonskin on the wall and all that bravado stuff, and it really just wiped out any really getting down with internationally trained human beings, the Chester Bowles, the other people who knew what the hell was going on, maybe this man who was fired, Roger Hillsman. These people knew, and unfortunately, and this is not in disagreement with anything you say, it's a supplement to what you say, they just wouldn't listen, and no one would listen to Wayne Morse and the others, and so that's how he perhaps prolonged the tragedy. The Cooper Church Amendment in 75, the effort to end the war, all had very little support.
Well, I think we should also make a difference between Johnson before the 64 election and Johnson prior to the 64 election, and that's Johnson prior to the 64 election wasn't elected. It was basically under enormous pressure to live up to the expectations of the people of Kennedy, to this whole idea of John F. Kennedy as being the greatest president this country ever had. That he was under this pressure, and he always felt a little bit that he needed to prove himself, and I don't think there was a tape that I've read a transcript that I've read at some point, but I think it's past the period that you guys cover in these volumes where Johnson basically says, well, I'm not going to be the one losing Kennedy's GD war. So there's that. Now once the election happens, then there's a whole different dynamic. But prior to the election, I don't think Johnson would have been able to really make a decision that he's going to withdraw the troops.
My name is Stephen Shore. The one observation that really stands out is the absolute contrast between the fantastic, what is technically called humant on domestic issues, and its complete absence in these discussions on foreign policy, where he seems to be solely concerned with domestic fallout, but with no feel at all for the personalities of national leaders that he's dealing with, or not in the slightest interest of taking their pulses the way he takes the pulses of various states and congressional districts. And I'm wondering, based on your wider observation of hearing more of the tapes and a greater knowledge of a period where I was just a schoolboy myself, whether you would agree with this assessment.
I think you can make a very quick case for it just by looking at who Johnson met with in the first 6 months of his presidency, the first 8 months of his presidency. It's overwhelmingly domestic. The people that come to the White House are overwhelmingly, they're either advisors on foreign policy, but if you're looking at other people outside the sort of circle of advisors, they're domestic policy people. He has some international leaders that come to the White House for official state visits. But Johnson makes a clear point in many conversations in these first few months of his presidency that he is not leaving the country. There's a big dust-up over visiting Charles de Gaulle, and de Gaulle wants to sort of meet him halfway in Martinique, and Johnson won't have anything to do with that. I mean, he won't even leave the borders of the country and go down to Martinique to sit down with de Gaulle. And so part of it, I think, is he's not really going out. He's been around the world. He's now president, and he's inside the United States, and he's got his agenda to push forward. And I think he's relying on advisors to a great extent to help fill in some of the gaps.
There was even an incident, I'm not going to get this probably 100%. I believe it was Bill Bundy was in, I believe, The Hague, and de Gaulle actually called him to come, I want to meet with you, on neutralization, and it reflects that attitude. And often when the state visits, he would express really kind of bitter resentment about the time he had to take to it with that at this period as well.
He would get very upset with meeting with ambassadors, particularly ambassadors leaving a country. They thought that State Department thought that he should sit down with these ambassadors and have kind of an exit interview, and he just thought it was a total waste of time.
Even King Hussein and Levi Eshkol of Israel, same attitude.
Yeah, one of the phrases you hear again and again in some of these conversations, usually when Johnson's talking to Bundy, is he says, "Keep me out of striped pants." He doesn't want to engage in these diplomatic niceties and ceremonial visits and so forth. Now, on the other hand, I've tended to look in my own research at the Johnson administration in terms of economic policy, which is almost completely a domestic policy issue. But where the international events and actors impinge upon that, Johnson does get engaged, particularly with the West Germans and the French and the British when we're talking about international monetary policy. And so, you know, you may be right. It may have something to do with, I think part of it's geography. If you're as busy as he is, and you've got your finger in as many dikes as he did on the domestic front, there's no way that you can take on a great measure of foreign policy activism, even if you wanted to. So that has something to do with it. But I think the other part of it is that he made a cold calculation that if the country rights its own ship and does things well, then it's going to be kind of a city upon a hill, a beacon to the rest of the world, and things will kind of fall in place.
Hi, Eugene, a student at Columbia. I was really taken by when they bring up Nixon. He's talking to one of the aides, and he brings up Nixon in a comment about Nixon in the newspapers. Could you go further into what was at this period in 1964? How is Johnson thinking about Nixon? Did he have a paranoia? Was he intimidated? If you can go further into his interpretation of Nixon at that time.
Johnson at this point loved to quote poll numbers. You would use it almost as a way to intimidate people. He was talking to in these conversations. He'd get the latest Gallup polls, and here's what they think of me in the in the Northeast or the out in the West Coast, and in the South I'm only at 68%. And Bundy at one point says to him, "Well, you can move in up northwards if you like, Mr. President." At this point, he didn't fear any of the Republicans. Nixon maybe more than the others. The context with Nixon that matters is Lodge, who of course is ambassador and former vice presidential nominee, and there was an expectation that Lodge was going to leave the ambassadorship to South Vietnam, come back and seek the Republican nomination. He'd had proxies for him in New Hampshire, and so there was a tension there. When Lodge says things, is he speaking for Nixon? Is he speaking for himself? What's the calculation going on in terms of that relationship? So that's probably where Nixon figures in as much as anything else politically, is in relation to Lodge. One of my favorite Johnson-Nixon stories is a little bit earlier than this period, but it's from when Johnson was in the Senate and Nixon had given a speech. And Johnson's aides the next morning asked him what he thought of Nixon's speech. And Johnson, at least is reported to have said that I don't know much, but I do know the difference between chicken shit and chicken salad. Now, at this point, I think he was probably a little concerned about Nixon, pulling something that was chicken shit. But he was afraid, I think, of Nixon because Nixon did have some standing, particularly on foreign policy issues. And so I think he definitely took note of Nixon and was quite concerned about what he had to say. He was a little bit concerned Nixon was going to get in the presidential race in a serious way, which would really throw off calculations and might threaten Barry Goldwater. I think Johnson was quite comfortable running against Goldwater from the beginning.
At this stage, Goldwater is just starting to emerge as the likely candidate. And there's a lot of talk about Scranton and Lodge and even Nixon still to some extent. Now, it's not long after this that we see Nixon kind of disappear as a likely candidate.
I think it's June 2nd, Goldwater wins California.
Yeah. And the Lodge connection is important here as well. I don't know if I mentioned it or not, but that one reference in the conversation I played where they referred to a Nixon criticism covered by the New York Times and the Herald Tribune that came after a visit with Lodge in Saigon. It was 2 days before that. And that's the commentary reported in those papers was based on an interview held in Saigon when Nixon was visiting Lodge there. So Johnson made that connection quite clearly when he read that.
You know, I wonder, just going back to looking at the whole 3-volume set and maybe the whole 6-volume set up to this point, what are some of the surprises, if there are any surprises that come out, and what are some of the overarching themes that come out of the tapes that maybe are clarified by the tapes as opposed to just documents?
My very quick thing is that Johnson doesn't cuss as much as I thought he did. You hear some of the samples and you see the salty language of Johnson, but Johnson's very serious, and he certainly uses language that is coarse when he needs to. But if you did a statistical analysis of what kind of words he uses, he's not a sailor in the Oval Office, except in certain circumstances, particularly dealing with the Secret Service.
In contrast to Richard Nixon, who can't get through 2 sentences without a swear word or an ethnic slur, pretty much universally.
Although academically, that's probably not the answer you were looking for. Something a little more depth.
We've also listened to, as has our partner in crime, Ken Hughes here, a lot of the Nixon recordings. And I remember when we were first considering jumping in and, can we even transcribe these? Because there are 3,000 hours of Nixon recordings compared to far less Johnson and Kennedy. And we determined early on we couldn't listen to every single one of them, nor could we transcribe even the majority of them. But we were interested in one thing in particular about Nixon, and that was that, perhaps, we knew about the Watergate tapes. We knew about the tapes that had been released on which there are plenty of salacious material, Nixon cursing this person and that. And we felt early on that the statesman would emerge once we got into the bigger bulk of the Nixon material. And boy, I don't know, Ken can probably speak to that more clearly than I, but we've had a hard time finding that statesman in there. Whereas with Johnson, and this kind of dovetails with what Professor Germany just said, one of the things that I noticed after getting into many months of these transcripts and recordings was that the Johnson treatment was not just about physical intimidation. That, if anything, it was more about persuasion. Over and over again, this is what you see in these recordings, where he's persuading people with all kinds of tools, everything from what he sees as pure logic and rational deduction to pride, selfishness, self-interest, the good of the party, the good of the country, right on down the line. He's bringing it all into account. But that's the thing that really jumped out in my mind.
I think, in a global sense, I think what comes out of these 6 volumes and taking such a close, kind of microscopic look at Lyndon Johnson and the presidency and the role that these tapes play is that you get a sense of what's required to be president, and that historians are going to cherry pick out what they're working on, whether it's Vietnam or war on poverty or civil rights, and so we all focus on these little issues. But if you step back and look at it chronologically and look at the narrative of the life of these gentlemen that have occupied the White House, I mean, they get up in the morning and are going to have to deal with maybe 8 or 10 major policy issues and have to make very serious decisions during that day that have consequences that affect millions of people's lives. And one of the things that really I think is a benefit coming out of the Johnson tapes is that we have this record of Lyndon Johnson having to be like the guy on the Ed Sullivan Show that spins all those plates and keeps them in the air and keeps them going while he's on the telephone, while he's going to meet with certain people, while he's meeting with heads of state, all while he's trying to run a presidential campaign. And so just the sheer volume of effort that it requires to be an effective president, or to be an ineffective president, but at least being out there, working hard and trying to implement your vision.
I would certainly agree with both of those perspectives. One thing that I would add, and a little bit more of a specific point that has really been striking to me, is the degree to which Johnson was a legislative tactician rather than a policy wonk. And there's some exceptions to that, but as a general statement, I think it's true. And the exceptions are usually when a particular policy detail was affecting a committee vote or some aspect of getting it through Congress. He was not that engaged with how policy would really play out on the ground in the way that Bill Clinton clearly was, or Jimmy Carter. A good example of that is in the war on poverty, which is one of my main research areas. And in the period where they were pushing the Economic Opportunity Act through Congress, he had very little grasp of what the Community Action Program actually was, what it would do in terms of power relations in American cities and well, communities, really, because it's an issue in rural areas of the South, too, in terms of destabilization of existing power relations and what the implications of that, positive and negative, are going to be. And he was focused on a few areas that reminded him of the New Deal and the way that the Job Corps program echoed things like the National Youth Administration that he had worked with, and the Civilian Conservation Corps as well, but not really paying that much attention to the social science that was driving this huge experiment in domestic policy in the community action titles of the legislation. And I see that fairly consistently.
If I could add one very quick thing to your question to maybe sum up what I was trying to say earlier, was there is a conversation that's picked up over the speakerphone in the Oval Office where Johnson had a particularly rough morning, and people kept coming in, and he goes on to one of his little tirades. And the thing that he says in this is, all these people coming in here when I'm trying to think.
Yeah.
And what comes across is that there's not much time for presidents to think.
Yeah.
Whereas academics, it takes us years to put out anything, fret over a sentence, but for a president, there's not a lot of time to sit back and reflect and think about things, and they have to rely on their information systems.
Could I just add one point that really builds
Just
on
hold on one second, please.
And that is on this thing where he chews out Humphrey.
Yeah.
It was a critically important legislative moment because we could not let that bill come back from the House and be passed, whether there was a Gloria Richardson or anybody else in the offing. There were major problems with the bill. For example, Title VI cut off of federal funds to school districts, and John Sherman Cooper in his brilliance saw that, my goodness, if we cut off funds to a whole school district in Louisiana, those two school districts or those two schools that are doing well and behaving and following the law are going to get messed over, just as the ones who haven't. So there needed to be major tinkering and fine-tuning of that law before it became legislation, and it really supplements what you're saying, that he didn't have that fine eye for legislative process per se, or maybe he didn't. Certainly not in that instance, and that could have really hurt. And then on the public accommodations, Title II, where it was, well, will it be all public accommodations or will it be a little rooming house where 2 or 3 people stay? And that was left out. So that when the law came up for constitutional review before the United States Supreme Court in Katzenbach versus Heart of Atlanta Motel, it sailed through because those true experts at legislation, Cooper, one of them, Douglas of Illinois, another case also. Anyway, these were the pros. I miss them tremendously.
I wonder if I could ask you a question.
Sure.
One of the things Johnson was quite good at was being partisan, but also being bipartisan when he needed to be, and reaching across the aisle. And certainly in the Civil Rights Act, he did that. I'm wondering what your memory of this issue of partisanship and bipartisanship on the Hill was when you were working there.
Oh, very much so. I think he tried very hard to be collegial and nonpartisan to the degree he could. He never forgot that he was a Democrat and that his allies were the Richard Russells and the other Democrats. But in the Bobby Baker investigation, other things that were happening at that time, there was a nonpartisan type approach. And even in foreign policy, building on the original Arthur Vandenberg idea of that disputes ought to stop at the water's edge, I think he was very good at that. He was masterful. There's no doubt about it. And he liked people. He was patient, as you said. He tried to be patient, but when his patience ran out, then he let people know all about it. But there was a great civility at the time. I remember other younger senators coming to John Sherman Cooper to ask advice on how to behave in the Senate and even how to vote. Dan Inouye, who was just a brand new senator, would come with deference to Senator Cooper. And then even Barry Goldwater would come and say, John, how are you voting on this? And then Albert Gore would come and say, how are you voting on this? And said, I can't go for the Civil Rights Act. And Cooper said, you know, my mail is running 20-1 against my voting for the act, but these people didn't send me up here to be a rubber stamp. And he then got reelected, notwithstanding that 20-1 alleged public opinion poll against his being a captain of the bill. Got reelected by the largest plurality of any senator in the history of the state. So people of Kentucky respected his integrity, his intelligence, and that he stood for something.
Your your comment about Johnson liking people made me think of this one point too that perhaps is worth mentioning, and that is that one of the other things I think all of us have learned listening to these conversations and transcribing them is that Johnson really did see the telephone as an important policy tool. He once told Jack Valenti, I believe it was, that if you use the phone right, you can save 3 or 4 hours every day. So that, you know, the idea was you can just get more done, you can reach more opinions, you can, you know, take into account more of the information that you need if you use this instrument. And he was an inveterate telephone user. As a result, we have 3 presidents who recorded a great deal of these kinds of recordings in their presidencies: Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. Johnson appears to be the only one of the 3 who used the recordings as an administrative tool while he was president. He had a team of secretaries who would come in at night to transcribe some of these recordings early on. Now, this process stopped not too long into the administration when they got too busy with other things. But it appears that what he used them for was he would call for these crude transcripts, and some of them were full of all kinds of mistakes, but nonetheless he would call for them whenever he had a follow-up meeting with somebody, and he wanted to see, you know, what I promised or what we talked about and what this person or that person addressed, and it helped him get along and get to the nub of some of the important issues that he was concerned with.
Yeah, I'm glad we didn't have text messaging in 1964. I don't think LBJ would have done well typing with his thumbs.
Johnson was pretty much open to having history and later years see what he said. He didn't go back and fine-tune them or
manipulate it now. Well, it's also pretty clear that he didn't think these would ever be made public, however. But I think it was Juanita Roberts who served him as one of his key secretaries. She said, you know, all this talk about secret recordings, there was nothing sinister here. This was just a tool, a mnemonic device of sorts, so that he could gather as much information as he possibly could. Nothing more, nothing less. Consequently, you do see the frequency of taping fall off. End of this year that we're covering today, 1964, and certainly in the middle of 1965. He just gets to be too busy, really, to manage the system, and they don't tape as much.
Well, I'm afraid we're actually running out of time, so we're going to put a stop of it here. Once again, I can't thank you enough, guys, for the work you're doing on the tapes and for making those tapes available. As historians, it's an incredible resource that you guys are doing. So thank you for coming here at the Wilson Center and presenting your work. And